95 years ago, on May 1st, 1936, the Empire State Building at 350 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan was opened to the public. It was a grand celebration, but it was a difficult economic climate to open what was at the time the tallest building in the world. Very quickly, it became derided as the empty State Building. But the fact that the building could be built and financed during the Great Depression is itself a testament to how extraordinary the construction was. The world's tallest building, with more than 2 million feet of usable, occupiable space, was built in just 411 days, still considered to be the fastest that any skyscraper has ever been built. But while it's one of the world's most famous buildings, the shadowy story behind how it was financed during the Great Depression is nearly forgotten history.
1929 was a time of optimism in New York City. As proof of the city's great rise was the fact that the city's buildings were literally rising up. Two great skyscrapers had been started: the Chrysler Building at 405 Lexington Avenue and the Bank of Manhattan Trust Building at 40 Wall Street. Both aspired to be the tallest building in the world, seeking to far surpass the 792-foot Woolworth Building, at the time the world's tallest inhabited building, and even Paris's Eiffel Tower, at 984 feet, the world's tallest structure. The race between the two, it seems, was personal. The New York Times Union reported, William Van Allen and H. Craig Severance, the architects, were formerly partners. And these two were only a beginning, it seemed. In his 1987 book, New York 1930, Architecture and Urbanism Between the Two World Wars, Robert A. Stern noted that 5 other projects, all planned to exceed 1,000 feet tall in the city, were planned. A building for metropolitan life on Madison Square, another on the northeast corner of Broadway and 49th Street, a third on the east side of 6th Avenue between 43rd and 44th Streets. A fourth proposal was for an almost unbelievable 1,600-foot building covering 2 blocks of Broadway. The Herald Tribune reported that the roof of more than an acre will be employed as a landing field for airplanes. The building would be even taller than another proposal at the site of the famed Waldorf Astoria Hotel, to be called the Empire State Building. The New York Times Union opined Manhattan naturally took to skyscrapers because of the narrowness of the island and the consequent value of real estate. The skies cost nothing, and mechanical progress was the only limit to the rapidity with which buildings are pushed into the air. But that turned out to be, well, not quite the case. Certainly steel structures could go much higher. The Associated Press asserted in October of 1929 that structural steel can go higher. How much higher is not predicted, although one engineer suggested 7,000 feet. The capability of elevators also may have been the limit. The same story suggested that the limit for elevators at the time was maybe just 2,000 feet, still an unbelievable height. But the limit turned out not to be steel, whether structural, for an elevator cable. In October of 1929, the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. The 2 buildings under construction would continue, the Times Union reported, but of the 5 others planned, Stern writes, the only one to survive the stock market crash was Shreve, Lamb & Harmon's Empire State Building. How? Dale Pappas, who has a Ph.D. in modern European history, explains, on the tour website, the Tour Guide Guidebook, its origins read more like a plot from an F. Scott Fitzgerald novel. The cast of characters from this novel begins with Pierre DuPont, scion of the DuPont family and one of the world's richest men. The DuPont company had made its fortune making smokeless powder for munitions, but during the 1910s, Pierre had expanded the company's interests. In 1915, that had landed him on the board for General Motors. While he is credited with helping to build the success of the company, he was looking for more than that. Following a plan by his former personal secretary and the assistant treasurer of DuPont, John J. Raskob, between 1918 and 1920, DuPont, both personally and through the DuPont Company, acquired stock, engineering a takeover of the automotive giant. In 1920, DuPont became president of General Motors, and Raskob became treasurer of both DuPont and General Motors. Raskob would become fabulously wealthy in his own right. But business would eventually run into politics. In 1923, DuPont resigned as president of General Motors, feeling that the company had become stable and was time to hand it over to an automotive company executive. But he remained chairman. He was replaced as president by Alfred P. Sloan. Sloan's long tenure would develop General Motors into the largest company in the world, and he worked well with both DuPont and Raskob. But in 1928, Raskob supported his longtime friend, Democrat New York Governor Al Smith, in his run for the presidency. The problem was that Sloan backed Smith's opponent, Herbert Hoover. At Smith's suggestion, Raskob was offered the chairmanship of the Democratic Party. Sloan was disgusted, insisting that Raskob either resign from the DNC board or from General Motors. Raskob chose the party. He sold his GM stock and carried his money to a new endeavor, and DuPont resigned as chairman in protest. The 1928 election went badly for Smith and Raskob. Hoover won 444 electoral votes to Smith's 87. Some predicted the crushing defeat represented the end of the Democratic Party. Raskob first went to Walter P. Chrysler, hoping to lead GM's rival, but he was rebuffed. This set of affairs would change the skyline of New York City. Dasim M. Barr and Ann Berman explained on the website of the Gotham Center for New York City History. Raskob had been fired from GM for backing former New York Governor Al Smith for president against Herbert Hoover in 1928, and rebuffed by Walter P. Chrysler, whose company he'd hoped to run instead. He needed a project, particularly one that would top the skyscraper Chrysler was building, and employ his friend Al Smith, who was out of work and hurting for money. Raskob and Smith were, historian John Taranak explained in his 2025 work, The Empire State Building, The Making of a Landmark, an odd couple, and an even odder pair to build the world's tallest building. Taranak notes that Raskob was not trained as an architect, a city planner, or an engineer. He was not in the construction business, nor the real estate business. Smith was also not in the real estate business. He was, Taranak writes, a politician. In fact, financial hardship was, in a way, responsible for the great building. The Waldorf Astoria had once been New York's grandest hotel, but by 1929 business had declined and the building was expensive to maintain. Barr and Berman write that by the 1920s the hotel was a relic. The ponderous building was expensive to maintain, and New York's society was increasingly living and socializing further uptown. Although Taranak also points out that the speakeasies were getting rich, while the Waldorf could not sell alcohol due to prohibition. In any case, by the end of 1928, the owners were ready to sell. The building, a prime piece of real estate, was acquired by the Bethlehem Engineering Company, with plans to build a structure of just 50 stories. Bethlehem had to take a loan both for the purchase of the land and an additional loan from Metropolitan Life for the cost of construction, but the company was not able to find sufficient financing. And before the hotel could be demolished, it missed a payment on its initial loan. It was forced to sell the property to the bank that had made the loan, Chatham Phoenix National Bank. Chatham Phoenix had been the creation of Louis Kaufman, a Michigan financier whom biographer Ann Berman referred to as Michigan's Gatsby. Kaufman was on the board of General Motors, a friend of Raskob and DuPont. Barr and Berman note that typically a bank would not want to get involved in real estate development and would quickly get the contract off its books, but Kaufman was the rare banker excited to try his hand at Manhattan real estate. They ask, if he had decided to let the whole thing go, who knows what would have happened to the site? Rather than have the bank take control directly, Kaufman first created a syndicate of investors, including investing a large amount of his own money, who pooled their resources. But to acquire the property, they took a loan from Chatham Phoenix. The property was bought from the bank, with the bank's own money. In her book on Kaufman, Berman explains that Raskob came to Kaufman with a new project that would be somewhat of a reprisal of their General Motors gambit with Pierre DuPont. The original syndicate was dissolved, and a new syndicate created under Raskob and Smith called Empire State Incorporated. But just 2 months after they announced plans to build the building, the stock market crashed. How did the project survive? The financing for the building was certainly, creative. When Raskob came on board, he brought new investors, including significantly Louis DuPont. But even with significant investment from Kaufman, DuPont, and Raskob, there was still a gap of some $13 million to build the building. To fill the gap, Barr and Berman note Kaufman then put his financing acumen to work. The company under Smith sold bonds, which was the equivalent of a loan. Kaufman created a subsidiary, which then bought the bonds, using a loan from the bank. As Berman writes, as Chatham Phoenix Bank, Chatham Phoenix Corporation, and Chatham Phoenix Allied Corporation were interlocking directories, entities run by LG and the same selected group of directors, no one objected to these serial investments in a single risky project. The construction was impressive. Matthias Jacobson of the Umeå, Sweden University School of Business and Economics explained in the journal Business Horizons in 2018 that the construction of the Empire State Building was not only the fastest erection of a skyscraper ever, but the construction company that took on the job allegedly began with no equipment or supplies that would be adequate for the job. The project was completed ahead of schedule and under budget. Instead of 1 year and 6 months as anticipated, it took only 1 year and 45 days. From the beginning of the construction to the 102-story building being opened at 95 years ago was just 411 days. Pappas notes the rapid construction came with a cheaper overall price tag because of the declining cost of labor. The construction also included innovative techniques, notably prefabrication and standardization of materials that Jacobson says took inspiration from Henry Ford's assembly line, and the use of a narrow-gauge railway constructed on each floor as the building went up to move materials. The building was constructed so fast that during the height of construction, it added an average of 4.5 stories a week. When it opened, the Empire State Building was the tallest building in the world. While that is common knowledge, it comes with a story and a cost. The story starts with the original race to the sky between the Chrysler Building and the Manhattan Company Building. As the two competed in a race to see who would be completed first and who would be the tallest in the race to the sky, Severance had redesigned his building. Jonathan Schiffman explains in Popular Mechanics. The foundations were strong enough to hold more height and weight, they concluded, so 5 more stories were drawn to bring the design to an even 900 feet. Certainly Severance believed 900 would win. Surely that was enough. After all, the Chrysler Building had already reached the 45th floor, and it seemed too late for Van Allen to build any major changes to extend it upward. Schiffman writes, Chrysler announced that his building would end somewhere between 840 and 850 feet. The steelwork was done, he claimed. But this, of course, was a ruse to throw off the competition, and anyone could clearly see that a derrick rose high above the arches that were now under construction. Rumors surfaced that the derrick was there to lift a 60-foot flagpole. Severance extended his own flagpole to make his tower reach 925 feet. The money was on the Manhattan Company. But Van Allen had a trick up his sleeve, or rather inside his building. He had added a 125-foot spire, which when added would take the building to 1,040 feet, not just surpassing 40 Wall Street, but becoming the world's first super-tall building, meaning over 1,000 feet tall. To fool the competition, the spire was constructed inside the building so that Severance could not see it and raised on October 23rd, the day before the stock market crash. At first, the change was not obvious, with Schiffman noting it took almost a month for news to hit that the Chrysler Corporation and Van Allen, not the Manhattan Company and Severance, had won the skyscraper race. A trade publication called the Daily Building Report broke the story, informing the world that the top of the Chrysler Building spire was the highest level the flag ever flew from a fixed point in New York City. The Manhattan Company Building was completed on May 1st, 1930, surpassing the Eiffel Tower and becoming the tallest man-made structure on Earth. The record wouldn't last. The Chrysler Building was completed on May 27th. Severance argued that his building should be considered the tallest building as it had the highest floor that could be occupied. The debate raged. But by then, Raskob's building was on the rise. The Chrysler Building was actually taller than the original plan of the Empire State Building, but Raskob had anticipated that Chrysler had something up his sleeve. In late 1929, Empire State Incorporated purchased an additional adjacent lot. This allowed a bigger base and raising the building to 85 stories. For good measure, however, he, Berman explains, took a page out of Chrysler's book. He added a 200-foot mast. But this was no mere flagpole. It was a mooring mast for dirigibles. Raskob's mast would actually be functional and take his building to 1,250 feet. How practical was the mooring mast? It was designed with advice from the Navy, which operated the nation's airships. Stern explains a cylindrical tower of aluminum, nickel, steel, and glass buttressed by upraised wings. The mooring mast only functioned twice. On the windy morning of September 16, 1931, when Fifth Avenue traffic came to a dead halt for half an hour as astonished drivers watched, a small, privately owned dirigible managed a 3-minute connection to the mast. And again 2 weeks later, when the Goodyear blimp Columbia docked just long enough to deliver a bundle of newspapers and a letter to Al Smith. The mooring mast was dismissed by critics. One called it a silly gesture. Moreover, Berman notes, extra floors and mooring masts did not come cheap.
When the Empire State Building was opened to the public on May 1st, 1931, it was the tallest building in the world, a distinction that it would keep clear until 1970. but the Great Depression nearly bankrupted the building. Raskob would survive the Great Depression, partially by engaging in trades that Forbes magazine in 2013 said were suspect and would be illegal today. He and DuPont partially survived by playing games like buying large chunks of each other's stocks and then selling them back to each other at a loss, creating fictional losses that could be used to avoid taxes. The building would eventually become profitable, and in 1951 was sold for $50 million, one of the largest real estate deals ever at the time, and enough that it was sold at a profit. But Raskob wasn't around to see it. He passed away in 1950. His family, however, netted $34 million for his stake in the building. Louis DuPont lived long enough to see the building become profitable, but Kaufman suffered. His dealings had put his bank on the hook for nearly half of the private capital needed to build the building, and the losses during the Great Depression and the expenses trying to keep the building open meant that the bank was bleeding cash. It was forced to merge. Kaufman was pushed out. He wasn't ruined, but very nearly. His stake in the building was much reduced, and he was gone from Wall Street. He passed away, nearly forgotten, in 1942. And while his deals did come back to haunt him, Barr and Berman are very straightforward about his contribution. They called him the secret schemer, without whom the Empire State Building would not have been built. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.